Hello, and welcome to What on Earth, the podcast of the Environmental Investigation Agency, or EIA. This year, the organisation is marking 40 years at the forefront of investigating and campaigning against environmental crime and abuse. From the early days as pioneers of working undercover, we've come a long way in 4 decades, and as part of our celebrations, this podcast will be talking with some of the longest-serving campaigners in EIA about the work they've done and the changes they've seen. I'm Paul Newman, EIA Senior Press and Communications Officer, and today I'm pleased to be joined by Alexander von Bismarck, Executive Director of EIA US in Washington, D.C. Sasha, welcome, and thanks for taking the time to share your thoughts with us.
Thanks so much, Paul. I'm looking forward to it.
Perhaps you could start us off with a bit about your background before you found your way to EIA.
Yeah, I started off as a wannabe biologist and studying fish ecology particularly in Africa, and sort of exciting field work, and then decided to get into the game of trying to change things more directly rather than study them. I think that's the best way to describe my path to EIA.
And when and how did you actually join EIA? What were your first impressions of it at that time?
Yeah, I bring up that example because that's really where I was. I was studying cichlids, this amazing fish, this amazing example of evolution in Kenya, in Lake Victoria, and I there saw the example of the demand really for Nile perch in this case, the demand from Europe for a fish that was really destroying the ecosystem in Africa. And in that context, I went home briefly to Hamburg, to Germany. And while I was still doing that work, just took a little time off and was sitting at the breakfast table and saw the Hamburger Abendblatt, the German paper there. And above the fold was a beautiful picture of a horrible subject, which was a huge pile of rhino horns in which you could tell from reading the story, a military warehouse in China. And I read that story and it talked about the undercover work required to go there, the danger that the investigator had to expose themselves to, the fact that they had to go back because the lighting was off the first time and take even more risk to get that shot, which now was looking at me, and looking at so many people in Germany to make the case that it was trying to make. I thought that was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. And so I volunteered in London within a few months of seeing that story.
Excellent stuff. And what was your first impression of the organization when you came on board?
It was really great. I mean, I was there as a volunteer, so I thought, geez, I should be able to get in, but I was subjected to extraordinarily tough interviews, including biology. But I managed to finagle my way in. I mean, it was clear that, the reason that it was tough to get in, even as a volunteer, is that it's a tight group doing very specialized work. And we've stayed relatively small over the years, but I saw that right away and I think learned then why that was the case and why even a small group, if it's built the right way around the right objectives and the right kind of approach, can have a huge impact.
And can you tell us something about how our US office, EIA US, came to be set up, when that was and how its work differs from the UK?
Yeah, well, it's the same founders set up the U.S. office just a few years after the UK, and I think for some time it was a bit focused on particular actions that can be taken in the U.S. There was, for example, one of the Bird Conservation Act, which really focused on horrific smuggling of birds from South America into the United States, and that was kind of a really important early campaign of EIA as a whole. And then in about in 97 or so, I led the office, and slowly it grew to be kind of its an additional real center for EIA. And I think now we really see the value of having the two main groups of EIA represented in the two big demand centers, globally. And I think that drives a lot of of our impact, because we can see that one of the biggest things we can do is to look at our own backyard and look at how we are consuming the world's resources really and causing a lot of the problems. And I think that's proven itself to be really helpful and effective.
Yeah, well, one of the things I've noticed in my time here is that when I first joined back in 2010, 2011, the two offices seem to have very separated areas of work. Like the US office was all about South America in terms of illegal logging. We were focused on Southeast Asia primarily. But I've noticed as we've moved along in the years, a lot of our campaigns have begun to intersect. I know we do things like HFC refrigerants. And although in the UK, our focus on that has been in the UK and European supermarkets, I see in the US you guys have been doing your own work in the same area. You've been looking at supermarkets and emissions from equipment, and you kind of built almost a parallel campaign in which a lot of the base data gets to be shared. And obviously we're all working on China, I guess, because that's the place where an enormous amount of the illegal wildlife trade goes. Do you see us getting closer and closer as the years go on in terms of a lot of the villains are wearing the same guys on either side of the pond?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think we're super close because we are trying to tackle the same fundamental problem of how rapacious demand for natural resources of all sorts causes environmental crime locally. And I think, as I mentioned, I think it's become very kind of organically self-evident that the two big demand centers are Europe and the United States, with, of course, China really coming online very quickly. And I think that defines, without even having to do a lot of policy around it, defines our relative centers, right, of focus. We're first and foremost taking care of the impact that our backyard has, meaning Europe and the United States, on all these problems, which is immense, whether it's climate change or the biodiversity crisis, et cetera. So I think that really defines the form of our ever-increasing cooperation. And I think the cooperation part is really active because you want to take that next step of thinking about what are the systemic changes that we hope for globally to tackle these issues. We do a lot with, for example, the big conventions around the world that tackle these issues, the Endangered Species Convention, right, the Climate Convention, and so forth. And there, of course, we are explicitly coming together to come up with hopefully really smart ideas for how to shape those agreements, those mechanisms we have for tackling environmental crime. And so building whole new institutions has been one of the hallmarks of EIA, that we don't just jump from, one case to another. We think about, how do we solve this so it sticks? Yeah. And that, I think, is a beautiful stage of cooperation that both offices are engaged very closely on.
Absolutely. I think we've gone from more doing the kind of, for want of a better term, hit and run style campaigns where we look at a single species or a single issue, and we're more in terms of the long-term strategic overview as to, okay, we want to arrive at a position where there isn't any wildlife trade. How do we begin to go about that, rather than just highlighting individual cases of it? So what was it like for you after joining EIA when you first went into the field for the first time as an environmental crime investigator / campaigner? That must have been, I would imagine, a little hairy.
Yeah, well, I would be lying if I said it wasn't incredibly exciting, and I was really very grateful to have the chance. I came as a nerdy biologist to it, and I think a bunch of us take that path. We start with a real passion for the problem, and we're searching for some way to apply ourselves to have a huge impact. And then along comes EIA that provides a pretty novel approach to that, meaning, hey, if you get extraordinary, irrefutable evidence of an environmental crime and you can tell that story well, you can have power that can take on the biggest structures, whether it's the oil industry or the illegal logging sector in the world. And so that was an incredible opportunity and to make that kind of transition. And I think EIA always holds that open to everybody. You join the team, you have an opportunity to find your way to contribute. And I really wanted to try out that side of things, the investigative side, the field work. And, it was thanks to EIA that learning on the job, step by step, feeling safe, was possible, and I was incredibly grateful for that.
And what was the first thing that actually took you into the field? What were you working on at that point?
My first investigations were mostly around illegal logging. Initially when I joined EIA, it really was, I had to do something useful, and jumping into investigations was not what I had to bring to the table. So it was really science work. It was desk investigations, which is a huge part of what EIA does, of course.
Yeah.
But then eventually I was really able to go in the field, and we went undercover to usually pose as timber buyers. And there, the challenges of filming at the same time that you were maintaining your cover. The equipment was different. It was bigger. It required
those old VHS cameras.
Yeah.
And what are your most vivid memories of working with EIA?
There are many of them. I mean, being undercover, like you describe in the early stages, was of course an extraordinary thing. But probably, there was one that really comes to mind that I can't shake, which was during some of the early investigations where we then were building a story, particularly in the United States. I was sort of trying to pull the evidence together to make the case in the United States that we need a new law. The first of its kind globally, to make the import of wood illegal. And to make that case, we had to find the most spectacular examples of illegal wood coming into the U.S. And one of them was, the first one, after the law, was to find ebony from Madagascar that was going into Gibson guitars. And I'll never forget working together with a really extraordinary campaigner and investigator in Madagascar. And this is really how we do our work. First and foremost, we stand by local environmental defenders that are really doing the tough work, and we find ways to support them, ways to help them, ways to get the story out. And that's what we're trying to do here. And we just suddenly found ourselves on this beach in Madagascar next to Majuala National Park, where one of the few places on Earth where an intact rainforest, comes all the way down to the ocean and sort of completes that ecosystem connection between an ocean and a virgin rainforest. We were going in there to actually document the cutting of ebony trees that were being pulled out and sent to the United States for guitars. And we were sitting on the beach, and Augustin was his name, and he just happened to be a musician himself. So he pulled out his guitar and he started singing about the rainforest in this extraordinary location that just epitomized what we were all fighting for. And I'm not going to get that particular memory out of my head.
And obviously, you played a part in many investigations during your time with the EIA US. They're not always wins. Sometimes they're works in progress. Sometimes we actually do get a very positive result. What do you think have been the biggest successes for EIA US in which you've played a part?
Yeah, what's cool about EIA is that we are relatively small, and we have a kind of team structure that you can feel close to a lot of successes that really other people did all the work on. So I'm lucky to feel part of an extraordinary amount of successes that, range from actually shaping the biggest environmental agreements globally, the Montreal Protocol, even within the climate agreement, the entire credit system within that, the CITES, of course, we've shaped for decades into being really the most enforceable agreement to address the biodiversity crisis, etc. I think if I say what I was most sort of viscerally had a front seat for, it was probably what I just mentioned, the job to kind of come up with the biggest stories of illegal wood coming into the United States so that we got a law passed there. And the investigation that happened to get that law passed was one that showed a cocaine dealer from Honduras that was actually building the next door for the Capitol building. This was sometime after 9/11, so they were building a big new door for more security. And it turned out it was being built by illegal mahogany from national parks by a cocaine dealer. And that was such the perfect story, to go to walk
It's all
to
the
the
elements.
hill. It hits all the elements. It's not something you want to celebrate, but boy, if you've got an objective to get attention and to illustrate a systemic problem, it couldn't have been better. And it contributed greatly, that particular story, to the passage of a major law, the first law in its kind, working with UK colleagues in Europe, building a similar law at the same time, to, for the first time, hold a demand country, a place that is demanding natural resources, in this case, timber, causing the crime on the other side of the globe often, for the first time to hold them to account, to hold us as consumers to account for financing that crime. Like a really fundamental idea that EIA has contributed to. And getting this law passed in the United States was a little bit broke the dam in some ways to other forms of that idea, and I think has had a big impact. And we then, so we, you get to pass a law, and then you get to bring the first few cases under the law. That's quite special to see that whole cycle, and it doesn't happen very often. So you have to really celebrate it.
Absolutely. Obviously, the game has changed quite a bit since you first joined. What changes have you seen in the nature of environmental crime over the years, and how do you think the organization has adapted to meet them?
Yeah, I mean, there are some things that we'll all be aware of the nature of trade, the nature of data, the ability to find and buy things on the other side of the world has increased. So the fundamental problem we've dealt with from the beginning, which was that you've got global demand for stuff that can be overwhelming for the local effort to protect something, whether it's elephants, whether it's dealing with illegal fishing, whether it's illegal logging. We've battled globalization in one sense, but really the challenge has only increased with the information explosion, because you can buy whatever you want at any time. And so we have to adapt to that. I think if I'm going to pick one thing for what needs to be adapted to most, I would say that we have to go to scale with our approach. We're a relatively small organization that tackles the biggest challenges. And one investigation of ours can take the local evidence of an environmental crime and bring the global consequences that are necessary to really make a difference. But we can't do that one investigation at a time, right? We have to set up systems that level the playing field so that local people defending their land, their future, their environment, when they come up with the goods, when they sometimes risk their lives to come up with the evidence to tell their story, we have to create a system that jumps to their aid and creates the consequences that are necessary. And I think EIA is uniquely, I say that after all these decades, that word is thrown around a lot, but I think it applies here. We are uniquely positioned to think about what systemically has to change, what connections have to be made between organizations, between the right systems in government and civil society, for there to be the consequences, the justice in response to local evidence of environmental crime. I think that is what we sort of have the front seat for, and what our biggest challenge is.
That brings me very conveniently to the next question, which is going to be, what do you think has been the secret of our success over the years? And I guess a lot of it is going to be how nimble we are and the varied skill sets we can bring to an issue.
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting, because EIA has been, one of its impact has been to spawn is the wrong word, but to somehow be part of in various ways of a variety of other NGOs that have taken some elements, and that is awesome. And but I think what EIA maintains that is still quite unique is, there are organizations that focus on being investigators, being reporters, and do an incredible job at exposing crime. There are other organizations that do an incredible job at campaigning and taking on the biggest power structures, and even as a small organization, having some impact. I think EIA is the one that has most combined those two things. to the greatest effect, and sort of really honed the theory of change that if you can find the irrefutable evidence and tell that story really well, you have power that is quite extraordinary. That the beginning of EIA was that. It was folks just with really their own credit cards coming up with connections in the ivory trade that inspired a ban on ivory trade because it was irrefutable. Honing that and making it apply to the biggest environmental challenges around, from climate change to the biodiversity crisis, is, I think, what we have really worked on and continued to hone over these decades, and what makes us so effective still today.
Excellent. And one final question. What challenges do you see ahead for the organization as we move into our fifth decade?
Yeah, I think it connects to that point about how do we connect? How does EIA connect to partners to do justice to the scale of the challenges that we have? Like I said, I think we have honed how to be effective by making partnerships with, for example, indigenous communities and forests and in the Amazon, and how to have their evidence collection result in actually getting to where the power is, where the money is, the biggest companies that are hiding on the other side of the globe with the big money that causes the corruption, that drives the violence. But we can't do it alone. We need to reach out and create connections with partners in civil society to do justice to the scale of that problem. I think that's our biggest challenge.
Excellent. Well, best of luck with that. And hopefully you'll be back in 10 years' time to tell us how we're doing then when we celebrate at 50 years.
I think we can do it. And I'd love to. Maybe it's another podcast. I'd love to talk about specifically what EIA is, really launching over the last few years with that view in mind. Look forward to that.
Oh, for sure. We'll have you back. Well, Sasha, thank you very much indeed for joining us today, man. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Paul. Appreciate it.
If you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, please watch this space for future episodes, and do check out our website at eia-international.org to find out more about our work. Thanks for joining us, and wherever you are, stay safe out there.